as people roll in. But yeah, my name is Mark Ferguson, coming to you from Christchurch this evening in New Zealand. But we'll be in Australia by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, so which is where I spend a bit of my time. Hopefully by the accent you can tell I'm from Australia, not NZ. But so I run a company called Next Gen Agri, and with Georgia we're working with AgriFutures in the goat industry to try and get greater uptake of fibre production goat fibre production in Australia. And yeah, I guess a bit of my background is I grew up in the northwest of Victoria. I don't know, when I was 10, 11, 12, somewhere there, we started running Angora goats, and so they sort of got under my skin from that time onwards. I've had a lot of pleasure out of being involved in Angora goats, been to South Africa a number of times as part of that, and so my brother Tim and his family, JC and Mez and Mum and Dad still running Angora goats at Hopeton under Mallee Park. But yeah, so we've, I guess, had a range of roles in the industry. Been on the board of Mohair Australia before, been on an MO board before, but yeah, as a breeder, and now as an extender of the story of mohair. But tonight we're focusing on the nutrition of reproduction. We're not going to go too much into the micronutrients, mainly it's sort of macro, so the energy required or management, I guess, required for improving pregnancy and lactation outcomes in fibre goats. A lot of the research we can sort of rely on is from Angoras, but a lot of it applies for Cashmere as well. So we'll get underway with some, and I'll share my screen. Is that all good, Georgia?
Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Excellent. Righto. So, yeah, underway. So I think that's my favourite photo of goats when we're farming at home. So I thought I'd start with that, but we'll get into the real story as well. But yeah, a couple of imports from Africa there. I guess we start out with a question, and in this format it's hard to answer that question, but feel free to jump on the chat at any point and ask your questions. And yeah, we'd love to answer those questions and have that discussion. But I guess when we're thinking about managing nutrition, there's two reasons we're doing it. One is to get more or get higher reproductive rates, and in a fibre production business, that's not always a really important outcome. Sometimes if a fibre specialist business, which sort of which are rare and natural fibres or where goats are, having heaps of extra kids isn't always a priority. But for some people, you'll have an objective to do that, and for others, you'll just want enough to replace your herd. But yeah, so depending on your aspirations, you'll either want or not want more kids. But as we'll get into, it's also important to manage nutrition during late pregnancy and early lactation because of the impacts on the fibre itself. So, and we'll get into that as we go. So even if improving reproductive rate isn't important for you, there's still good reasons why managing nutrition over that critical period is important. But I think asking this question is important because, and I do it to a lot of sheep producers about lambs, and that's because often when we ask people, they say they do, but then they sort of don't do anything don't change their practices to do anything differently. So, yeah, I guess if it is something that you want to do, improve your reproductive rate in your goats, then something will need to change rather than just status quo. So the humble doe, either Angora or Cashmere, is the engine room of a mohair or Cashmere production business. They're the ones out there doing the hard yards year in, year out. They're the ones providing those great kids, and we know that's where, particularly in a mohair business, there's a lot of value coming from kid mohair, and our younger goats tend to be obviously our most profitable animals in terms of fibre production. So we do need those young animals coming through, and so to do that, we need a great herd of does, and so they are our priority, and they'll be our focus tonight, really. and how we give them the best chance of doing a great job for us. There's been we'll continue on different, as we go through over the next few years, we'll have different aspects of this. I'm not going to delve too deep into the animal health stage, and we've had a couple of webinars already around that, but yeah, I'm going to try and focus on nutrition, but obviously animal health is a critical part of that as well, and managing that. So if we get into dough nutrition, and it means different things to different people, and as I started out, we're really talking about sort of macronutrition, which is energy and protein really, and obviously if your animals are deficient in a mineral, then that's going to be important as well, but often it's our macro ones that would cause us the most grief. I often get, not often, but sometimes get calls from sheep producers thinking they got they're missing an element or something, but when you work out that the kind of nutrition being offered and the feed demands for those animals, it's just a straight out energy deficit that those animals in, and not 9 times out of 10, but a lot of the time, a lot of what we're lacking is actually nutrition, not anything specific. That said, we know in goats they do have a high mineral requirement, and most of you have been doing it for a while will know that. Things like iodine can be important, and depending where you're farming, there'll be other trace elements that are important as well. So we know that there is a requirement for mineral nutrition, but I think often we hide behind that, or we sort of reach for the lick block or for the mineral drench when maybe a few 100 grams of barley or something might be actually what we need to get those those animals out of energy deficit and into positive energy zone. So before we do get on to those I guess our adult does, one thing that I've sort of been really enjoying getting back into thinking about and the goat fibre production again, and getting my head around the literature again, and really enjoying that. But one thing that strikes me when I look at, particularly, there's a lot of South African studies, obviously, but we do tend to have, don't do an amazing job of getting our young does up to speed in that first year of life, and that depends. There's some people are amazing and feed them really well, and others they sort of struggle away. Obviously, Angoras aren't known for their explosive growth, and so they're selected as fibre animals, and Cashmere have a bit more growth in them. But yeah, both I guess don't really, or will grow well if nutrition supplied, but sometimes we aren't able to do that. But if we look at but I think what we see across sheep and goats is the better we do our young animals, the quicker they become a really productive animal in our herd. And so giving them a really good start, often in a mixed enterprise, these animals, because they're not kidding and they're not really doing much until they're they're kidding first at 2 years of age, they can be sort of chucked somewhere and let cruise around, and they might get a few more worms than they should, or they might get a few more feet problems they should, or whatever, because they haven't been quite managed as well. And I guess that presents an opportunity for us to do a better job. If we look at some data coming out of South Africa, Greta Simon, who I think is pretty much between her and Bruce McGregor in Australia, probably done the lion's share of sort of fibre goat research over the last few decades. But if we look at this is maiden doe weight at mating, and some pretty scary numbers in terms of how light they can be. And this was, she studied 12, or her and a team studied 12 different Angora studs in South Africa, and this is the maiden ewe doe weight at mating, and then the kids weaned from that mating, and so it's very clear that both in conception rate and in kid survival, then the heavier we put our does to their first mating, then the better they go. So if we sort of mating them in these early 30s or 35, we do get plenty of kids on the ground, but we do a much better job if they're up into that over 40, 45 kilos. So we really should be aiming to get our maiden does at their mature weight by the time they go to the buck the first time, which is a bit of a struggle. And I think you sort of shoot for the stars and land on the moon type approach. You might not always get there, but we do need to get those does up to speed. And I think when we look further into her data, and we see this probably play out a bit over the industry. If you don't get them up early, so this is doe age at kidding over sort of 10 years in those different studs. So we probably wouldn't have a lot of goats running out into these ages. Some people would, but maybe 7 or 8 is where you'd be pulling them up, but depending on your production system. But this is the birth weight of those does across those different studs. And what the story it's telling me is that we're really not getting our animals our does up to full capacity in terms of how well they're going until they're sort of 4, 5, 6 year old. So we expect a depression in kid birth weight from our maiden does, but we really should have that up to full capacity by the time they're in that second kidding. So depending on where you're at and how well you feed them, this might not apply to you, but I think getting those does up as young animals is a priority, and if that may or may not be what you do now, but and we'll come back to this birth weight story, because this is the key aspect of doe nutrition that's probably our struggle as an industry. Now, there's lots of conflicting jobs on any farm, and many of you might be doing things off farm as well. So there's plenty of things to do, and I know that there's heaps of important jobs, but we sort of get one chance at our pregnant does and to do a good job for that kid crop. And so in my mind, they're our most important animals, and our most important job is looking after them, make sure they're getting their adequate requirements and looking after them sufficiently to get them up to speed and kidding well. If we think about what her job is through pregnancy, so for us it's chuck the bucks out and then wait 150 days and Shazam, we get some kids out the other end. But if we think about what's actually going on, we've got a doe that's partitioning nutrients. So we've got amino acids and sugars, glucose, being delivered through the bloodstream, through the placenta into that growing fetus. And so of the priority of those jobs, the first one she's got to do is stay alive, which is brain and nervous system. So that's the highest priority job. But then the next highest priority is sending nutrients to that placenta and to fetus. And so that means that these lower priority things, her own tissues, will get depleted if we're underfeeding her. So if we're not sending enough energy and protein down through the rumen and into the bloodstream, then essentially we're wearing down her maternal tissues. And my PhD in sheep, you clearly see that animals would petition to that fetus and away from themselves, and that then presents a range of issues which we're going to cover, because with her doing that, she won't, as she gets more depleted, then her own welfare gets compromised, and you can get into positions where you're actually having less than optimum doe survival around kidding, because her energies or her energy supply has dropped and her storage is down. But then we also start compromising the kid itself, or the kids themselves as well, which is so. I guess I did up this diagram to make sure we're really clear about what's going on in why we're feeding animals, and that's because we're essentially sending nutrients down the bloodstream to those fetuses, and we're trying to make sure that she doesn't deplete her own performance or her own tissues while doing that. That gremlin there is actually a lamb, not a kid, but I'll say full disclosure there, but I couldn't find a goat one, and it was hard enough to find a lamb one. But if we think about what's going on through that gestation period, that 150 days from conception through to kidding, there's sort of two big jobs that are happening in the doe, and we've got placenta weight increasing or growing the placenta in the first sort of 60 to 90 days, and then placenta is pretty much fully developed by about day 90. But you see there that the kids are doing nothing really in that first 90 days. So there's hardly any. This is fetal weight here, so total weight of fetus. And so really in the first 90 days, nothing much is going on. It's all about that placenta being developed. But then that last 60 days is when it's game on, and that's the critical period for us to make sure we've got nutrition right. You can kind of do this bit poorly. The first 90 days, not ideal to run that doe's condition score down, but it's kind of less critical then. Once you get into the last 60 days of pregnancy, that's when it is mission critical in terms of supplying enough nutrients to meet her needs, her maintenance requirements, as well as the needs of that growing fetus. Because at some point in here, that fetus could be doing 100 to 150 grams a day. Obviously, this is actually a lamb graph, so birth fetal weight's going up a bit higher than what we'd see in a kid, but that's exactly the same thing that's happening. Feel free to chuck any questions in the chat, or and we'll endeavour to answer them. So if we think about what that actually means in terms of the energy required of that doe, this is so the dotted line there is a dry doe, so and I'm not sure what kilos did I calculate this at. It doesn't matter anyway. It's 100 in percentages. So that's your dry doe in chipping away for that period. So her energy requirements that we set it at 100%. By around sort of day 90, we're starting to get a slight increase in energy requirement of a doe, and so that's the growing requirement of sort of maintenance plus that kid requirement, or that placental requirement. By the time we get up to here at kidding 150 days, we're sort of over 200% of what she required if she was dry, and then the twins really start separating out. So anything with multiples on board has a massive energy requirement, and so by the time we get out to sort of near peak lactation, our twin bearing does almost sort of 300% of their maintenance energy requirement. So I guess we need to think about that, because and I guess there's a few things here which we'll talk about, and I'd like you to consider is if all those animals are running in the same mob, so we've got dries, singles and twins all running together, that's probably not an issue if they've got heaps of feed around them, and we'll talk about that a bit more. But if we are restricted for feed, and I acknowledge if you're running small numbers, if we're running a few hundred head, it's not easy to have different mobs and different paddocks and stuff depending on your setup. But if you can, then, and you are short on feed, then your highest priority are those twin bearing or those multiple bearing does, because their energy requirements are ramping up and it gets quickly out of control. And so letting her reduce her body weight or reduce her condition score is a big red flag for both her survival, but obviously the kid's survival as well. So I guess it's really important to consider that they're all not just equal, and just the scale of the difference that their energy requirements are. For most of the time, you won't run animals into a protein deficit. Growing animals, for sure. So our kids up until that job that we've got to get our maiden does up to hopefully their adult weight by the time they hit the buck the first time, but somewhere near it, 80-90% of their adult weight. That will need protein. So growing animals definitely can be protein deficient or not enough protein to grow their tissues. But most adult does are really an energy equation. Most feedstuffs have enough protein in them to provide maintenance requirements around protein, because they're recycling their stores and they're not building a lot of tissue like a young animal is, building all its organs and all its muscles. They're just replenishing those tissues and laying down fat, hopefully. So it really is an energy game, and so that's when you're thinking about comparing feeds or comparing opportunities in terms of where the animals can be. You don't really need to think about protein. It's mainly an energy, unless you're in a strange circumstance where you are really protein deficient, like on a, not that anyone would be feeding fodder beet to a goat, I imagine, but if you were, like really high sugar, feed stuffs that have low protein, that'd be on this scenario where you could get yourself into trouble. But most cases, that's not going to be the case. And so, I guess the important thing that I really want to talk about tonight is the consequence of getting that wrong, and that's essentially is low birth weight. And so, whichever part of that graph you get wrong, so if you underfeed either your singles or your twins or both, then the outcome of that is that they end up in lighter birth weight, and that causes all sorts of grief in terms of our kid vigor. One thing that is good in goats compared to sheep is that we don't tend to have much dystocia, or we don't have, in terms of in sheep, if you overfeed singles, you blow up birth weight and then reduce kid survival, or lamb survival, because those animals get stuck in the birth canal, either clinical dystocia, as in stuck and need assistance, or subclinical, where they just take a long time to get born and suffer a bit of brain damage on the way, either through lack of oxygen or through just being squeezed, and then don't have the vigor that they would, and are more prone to all the other things that can go wrong. But I can't find any evidence of that, and I think Susan Robertson might be online, and I read her review paper today, and there's not much evidence that we can blow up those singles to a point where they get stuck, whereas in lambs there is. So that's a good thing. So it means we can run our if we've got plenty of feed, then running our singles and twins together at, like, feeding them as if they're twins is not going to have a negative impact on kid survival, and should be all relatively positive. That economically, that wouldn't make sense if you were short on feed. You'd be better off prioritising that feed to the twins. But the downside is not what it would be in a sheep production system.
Sorry, we've got a question from Lynn and Don Carter in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Yep, I'm about to get on the amount of energy required, and so I think the next graph might be, hopefully they'll answer that question. Minerals will depend on your circumstance, Lynn or Don, or both. And most of the dystocia we see, and happy to hear all of your lived examples, but most of the dystocia we see is through malpresentation, through being stirred up or whatever, not through birth weight itself. Well, that's what the literature tells me anyway. And so we do see heads back or legs back or whatever, which is normal dystocia, but you don't make, I guess the important thing is you wouldn't make dystocia worse by overfeeding them in terms of nutrition. There's can be mineral problems go wrong that just have slow births and stuff, but we don't. Yeah, again, it's a big rabbit hole. And Michaela, I haven't seen any high sugar feed where I've seen any problems in terms of protein deficit, but mainly it's an energy problem. And again, we're not talking making it sound like it's always problems. These are just opportunities, I guess, to get better kid vigor and therefore better kid survival, and better conversion of what we know is there compared to what we end up with. And we probably won't get too deep into. There's other ways you can keep those kids alive, obviously, and lots of people online will have shelter and ways to do that. I guess if we're thinking about extensive kidding, so kidding in the paddock, what are the ways how do we fortify those animals to make sure they stand up and thrive? And I guess whatever your kidding solution is, good, strong, big kids are going to be the ones that are more likely to live anyway. So this is the game that we're playing, I reckon. This is the most important graph we're going to see tonight. And I acknowledge that most of you aren't as used to looking at graphs as me, so maybe there's too many graphs, but I do love a good graph. But this is, again, data out of South Africa, again, because we don't have a lot of this good data in Australia, and this is something, I mean, some of you will have collected some of this data before, but this is South African conditions, a range of different kidding. So some of this just out in the veld, out in the extensive, some of this on pastures. I don't think any of them are sort of intensively or not shedded anyway, so some intensive management, but essentially being there to weigh kids at birth and looking at survival. And so, yeah, I mean, the story goes, the heavier they are, the more survive, and that's pretty, I guess, the same as we see in the sheep industry and would be expected. And we've all seen weak, small kids before and battled with them. But yeah, the average of where Bruce McGregor did some work, and that his average was around 2.8, 2.9, somewhere there. The average in South Africa was between 2.8 and 3.1, depending on the farm. Obviously, multiples are the ones down in that lighter area, and the singles are out in the heavier area. And I think hopefully over time we can get some more data around this and look at singles and twins and whether there's any interaction there. But essentially, the heavier we get them, the more survive. And so that's kind of the job to do, or the issue if we underfeed our pregnant does, then we run them, because we'll run her out of energy, and we'll run our kids into smaller birth weights. The other thing that we won't get into tonight, but we will cover over time, is kind of the genetic overlay around this. So when we did the progeny test back in 2002, which is a lifetime ago now, where we had a range of size from industry, all of those sizes are no longer relevant, I suppose, all been replaced by different animals now. But there was a genetic difference in birth weight, and so you can genetically improve birth weight. So some size through heavier kids than other size when mated over random does. And in the South African work, there's about a 50% range in survival depending on the sire used. So some kids of some size are much more prone to survive, and others the opposite way. I think I certainly have a strong memory of a particular sire we bought that his kids were completely useless, and we won't name names, but yeah, like every one of those kids was born weak and without intervention sort of would have died pretty much. And so, yeah, and I don't know if others have seen that kind of scenario where you have a really a sire that's just not good for that particular aspect, and then others that are pretty robust. So we've got a genetic overlay, but whatever genetics you're using and whatever sort of goat you've got, then still improving nutrition during that last 60 days of pregnancy still provides an opportunity to get kid birth weight up, and therefore get survival up. And again, other ways we can improve survival around management as well, in terms of shelter and that. But I guess just straight out what we can do with nutrition, it's really get some condition on those does. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole recently to try and provide some, I guess, put something around the obvious, which is essentially why light animals are less likely to live. And I guess there's two reasons. One is they don't have as much resource. So the lighter they're born, the less they tend to have less brown fat, less fat totally. And so less ability to generate heat quickly, which is what they need. They obviously need, when you're born, your job is to stand up quickly and then get on and suckle. And if mum's been fed well, she'll have good udder development, good colostrum development, and then you'll be good to go. So you can sort of, once you get that first belly full, they tend to be, as we know, they're a lot more robust after getting a feed in them, because they can start generating their own heat from that feed. But in that gap between birth and that first feed, if conditions are bad, or if the doe hasn't been fed well enough and her colostrum hasn't developed as well, so you're not actually getting a rich colostrum straight up, then that's when they're prone to exposure and everything else going wrong, and then getting weak, and then being exposed to predation and all the rest of it. But I went down a bit of a rabbit hole to try and work out the surface area to weight ratio at different weights of kids and lambs. And so basically this graph showing that the higher or the lighter you are, the more surface area to weight ratio you've got. So you're basically like a radiator. You haven't got, there's a lot more surface area you've got to try and keep warm with your limited resource. Whereas as you get heavier, and Nathan Scott talks about a piece of paper versus a brick in terms of density and in terms of surface area, which is something we can easily think of in our heads. But essentially, those lighter kids are just are losing a lot more heat for their given, because they don't have because they get more surface area per body weight, and they don't have as much energy to start with. So there's sort of a double whammy in terms of why it goes pear shaped, and so it makes plenty of sense why those light ones lose a lot of heat and then are in trouble. Again, as soon as they get some feed into them, then it's a different story, because they're getting heat from that milk supply. So I don't know how many online regularly condition score their does, but I guess I ran Angoras with my brother for a fair while, and I don't think we ever did. And it wasn't probably until I did a lot of work in the sheep industry, and we've done a lot of condition scoring, and even in the sheep industry, there's probably only 20-30% of the industry that does it routinely. But it is our ticket to managing our does. Condition score is really what the outcome is. Weights are good, but not everyone's got scales, and scales are difficult to move around, whereas condition scoring you can do it in a set of portable yards, or anytime, anywhere almost. And it's that condition score that is linked to birth weight. You can't really find good evidence in the literature, but just in goats, you can find heaps of literature in sheep, but everything, that 2010 paper from Greta Simon does, all roads lead to or point to that being the case. So really, and it makes sense. It's the condition score is the reserve tank of an animal, and so if we run it down by underfeeding it, or by having just tough times going through, then she won't have as much resource to generate towards that, to send to that kid, and she'll have less colostrum and less milk and all the other things that go along with that. So managing condition score is the important thing, and we'll talk through a bit more about that in a second. The other thing that we don't do heaps of in the industry is ultrasound pregnancy scan for multiples. Some people will be doing this, and some people won't be. And again, if on different scale, it is tough to get a pregnancy scanner in. There has been a lot more scanners set up in recent years because of the sort of real focus in the sheep industry. Generally, Angoras are going to be kidding a little bit later in the season compared to, or also will be able to be scanned later in the season, because the bucks have gone out a little bit later than the average of the sheep industry. So there should be some capacity around. If you're if the bucks are in sort of, I know lineal probably won't be in March, but others sort of April, May, depending if you're if you're lambing, kidding August, September, there should be some scanners around that you'll be able to get access to. It is just if you've got heaps of feed, then you don't really need to worry about it. You can just bore it into all of them. But most years, or certainly some years, that's not going to be the case. And so separating out those twin bearing does, and if you are limited for feed, then making a priority of the twin bearing does and the twin bearing skinny ones. So if you've got a doe that's got twins on board because she was either fat at kidding, or she's just naturally fertile, or even triplets. And if she's lean, as in condition score sort of 2, 2.5, then you know that she's setting herself up for a low birth weight kids, and therefore a low survival chance of those kids. So in all the economics we do around the industry, the best thing you can do with your money is to feed it to a skinny twin bearer. Like, they'll be the ones that will convert the best. They'll be the best conversion of energy into money, because for every 100 grams of birth weight you get on, you increase your chances of survival in those kids. So, and so in those tighter years, which we're definitely in one of them at the moment, knowing who's got twins on board is critical. So from about day 40, you can see pregnancy up to about sort of day 90, where they start getting tangled, and it's hard to get individuals separated out. But so around that day 80 of pregnancy, ideally you've got the preg scanner turning up to help you work out who's pregnant, who's not, and who's got singles and who's twins. So I think, yeah, day 80, 85, 90 is ideal from the day the bucks went in, and then you'll get most of them. The small at day 40, it's not easier. So if they're 40 days since they were conceived, you can definitely tell they're pregnant by then. Not easy to identify multiples once you get out. So you let them get to about day 50, then you can get to the sort of youngest fetus is 50 days old. You'll get most of them identified. That's assuming a 5-week joining. Yeah, and happy to talk through any individual circumstances. But yeah, as they get a bit older than that, you start getting, it's hard for the preg scanner to work out the tangle of legs and heads and stuff in the uterus. So what we're talking in condition score is on the short ribs, so not down on the long ribs, which you might have seen some people do. It's on so between the pin bones and the end of the long ribs. So and you're just feeling, you're palpating the short ribs, you're feeling over the top of the spine, you're feeling that tissue down through between the top of the spine and the wings of the short ribs, and then you're feeling the cover over those short ribs, and basically 3 is our ideal, and 3 is a nice condition score to identify, because you can see how flat it is from the top of the spine to the end of the short ribs. So if you're feeling through that area and you've got a bit of a dip, then you know they're sort of slightly under 3. If you're feeling in that area and it feels like it's it's bulging out a bit, you know you're better than 3. And so that's kind of a good number to have in your head. Condition score 1 might have slightly less muscle in that, but essentially, and the important thing that we're looking at when we've got condition, we've got both fat and muscle, and both of those are a handy resource for a pregnant doe or a lactating doe. They've both got energy in them, and they can draw on both those energy sources. But generally, if we can hit our condition score 3 for kidding, that we haven't done the economics in fibre goats, but there's a good chance that's somewhere where you're running enough animals to be profitable, but also you've got them in a condition where you'll get good kid survival, good colostrum production, good milk production, and set yourself up for a good kidding. Perfect world, you can run your singles. Thanks, Georgia. Perfect world, you can run your singles slightly under condition score 3, because they will have a naturally higher birth weight. And so if you're tight for feed, then they're the ones you can put a little bit of pressure on. And ideally you want your twins over condition score 3, and twins and any triplets. But if you run them together and things aren't ideal, then the opposite will occur. So you'll end up with twins that are lambing, kidding in condition score 2 or under 3, and your singles will end up over 3. That's just how they will naturally be, because of the energy differential, or the energy requirement differential between those animals. So, and what you want to do is kind of force it against nature almost by about half a condition score. So again, if you've got heaps of feed, that's easy, because you just put them all fat. But if you haven't, then getting those twins out is important, and really important to get those skinny twins out. They're the money, well, they're the ones that will cause you the grief or create an opportunity. People tell me that we all tell each other probably that goats will internalise fat, so it doesn't matter if they're or they won't have much subcutaneous fat, and so it doesn't matter if they're a bit lean on the spine. Well, and they do internalise their fat a bit, but in reality, and we've all seen that when you look after goats and feed them well, then you will get them in good condition score, and that's where we'll get our birth weights, because our current management is landing birth weights that are sort of suboptimal. So there is opportunity to get that cranked up a bit. In terms of, if you're just doing the mob, then sort of 40 or 50 within the mob will tell you, in the herd, will tell you enough about the herd. So 40 of, doesn't matter if there's 1,000 in that herd or 40, that will tell you the average of the herd. So if you want to just get a handle on how they're going, then you only have to do a couple of racefuls, so you don't have to do all of them. At those critical times, like at those critical times, you want to do them all. So if you are short on feed and you're looking to where your priority should be, then that's when you want to condition score all the animals and separate those ones that are light off and feed them separately. As John's just pointed out, unless you've got a heap of does, you can run them all as if they're carrying twins. And probably in that case, you still want to have a look, get your hand on a condition score them, and make sure that if they are running twins in that mob, if they're getting light, then see if there's options to do something with that. Because if you run them all together, they don't all respond the same. There's a natural distribution. Some might have reared twins last year, so they might have started the year a bit light or whatever. So still, even if you are running together, if there is an opportunity to put those lighter ends somewhere, then there'll be opportunity in that to improve survival. But yeah, if we're running small numbers, then they're more likely going to be in the same herd. But we just need to get a little bit more hands-on, I guess, and just assess that condition score as a few times a year. Once you've got a couple of inches of mohair on them, then if they're wet, you probably see the lighter ones. But the subtlety of getting your hand on them is until you get your hand on them, you don't really know what's going on. And the more mohair they got them, or more cashmere they got on them, the harder it is to actually tell what's going on under the bonnet. Obviously, in wool sheep, it's even harder. But and I think it's really good for the brain to get your hand on them and feel the bones. If they are light, then it hits you pretty solidly. If they are light and you feel that bony spine and the bony short rims, that'll hit you harder than kind of just running them past you and hoping that they're okay. And I think the more I've found anyway, the more we measure stuff or assess stuff, write it down, and then you go, oh, they were a bit light this year. Then look at the kitting result, and it's all about building that knowledge around what's going on under your management and your herd. So hopefully this answers Lynn and Don's earlier question, but I'll give my microphone over so I can see it. And this will be available, and we can send out this as a graph too if anyone's interested. But this is, so depending on how heavy you are, let's shift it a bit. Depending on how heavy your does are, obviously that impacts their maintenance requirement. But then, so you're through 43 to 55, and that would cover most mature Angoras, I think. So they're just as dry animals, not pregnant, that kind of range between just over 6 to just over 8 megajoules of energy per day. And by the time they get out to sort of kidding in a 45 kilo doe that's kidding is up over 20 megajoules of energy per day. So that's a couple of kilos, or not quite, but 1.8 kilos of barley or something like that. So they actually, or heaps of pasture, obviously, if you're hopefully doing that through pasture most years, because it gets pretty expensive otherwise. But you see the ramp up in the amount of energy required, and it's worth thinking about what you have got available and whether they are getting enough of that. and I better rattle on. I'm dragging on to get done in the hour, but by all means, we can. We'll put this graph up on the hub, and so people can grab it and have a look as well. And I think it's we'll do it for lactation as well if people are interested. But the point of it is that it's big. There's a lot required, and there's a big gap between singles and twins. And so if these are running in the same herd, then unless there's heaps of feed, then these ones might be starting to get suboptimal feeding, and therefore not. And if if they get their maintenance, then we'll get optimum birth weight, or we'll get maximum birth weight. If they get sub maintenance, then we're going to get a lower birth weight, and we're going to get less colostrum, less milk, and all the rest of it. The other thing that's specific to goats that's not as big in sheep, or certainly not a nutritional battle in sheep for abortion. Generally, lambs are in a different, because of differences in the way that pregnancy is maintained, but you can get some significant rates of abortion in late pregnancy in does. So that's another thing we need to be careful of. Often it's a weather-induced event, and a lot of the spontaneous aborters have been sort of removed. There was a big problem in South Africa, but a lot of these events are culled out now, and so the animals tend to be less responsive to those shocks, I guess. But we still have, if you get a cold event or a severe restriction of nutrition, as in they're locked in the shed for a couple of days while you're shearing or something and it's cold, and then you chuck them out and it's cold, whatever. Like if you get a bit of a shock to them, you can get significant abortions. So these are different farms in South Africa, those different studs, and so some of them over 4 years average 10% abortions and these are not zootic or like disease abortions. These are energy abortions, and so another reason to be careful in that last 60 days of pregnancy is because not only can we impact kid birth weight when they're born, but we can also in goats specifically, we can end up with an abortion event and therefore lose that kid before it even is born viably. You see that some are managing it really well, getting very small numbers of abortions, and this is again over average, I think, for 4 years. But some are averaging pretty significant numbers, which, and I don't know if anyone's had much experience. I haven't witnessed this personally in where we run them, but we we ran them in a slightly warmer environment than most. Although the frost wasn't that's warm. But anyway, so that's another thing to consider when we're thinking about late pregnancy, is that not only are we have to worry about the sort of broader, longer term condition score management, we have to also worry about short term stuff in terms of causing a glucose drop in the blood, which causes cortisol release in the fetus, which knocks off the corpus luteum, which ends up terminating pregnancy in terms of the biology that's going on. People ask what's best to feed, and generally it's the cheapest form of energy you can find, as in understanding how much energy is in different feeds is more important than what we call the feed. So hay or silage or grain or whatever are all different. But you can have good hay or good silage, or you can have bad hay or bad silage. And you can often compare them on a cents per megajoule of energy basis. And so, and you'll know what your goats, I mean, they'll eat most, I've seen them fed pure wheat. I've seen them fed lots of different things. Like they generally adapt to lots of different things. But yeah, it's more important to know how much energy is in the feed stuff. If you are having to feed them with grain or feed them with a supplement, than is knowing what that supplement is. So really do strongly suggest that you get feed tests. If again, this is more important when things are tough and you're actually having to make decisions around supplementary feeding. When there's plenty of pasture around, then these things aren't anywhere near as important. But getting a feed test done is well worth the $60 or $70 that's going to cost you to do it. For grain, it's pretty safe. Like if you're feeding barley and you get it from the same, and yeah, generally megajoules of energy in barley is going to be pretty good. Oats can be fairly variable. Lupins are really pretty consistent. So grains, you're probably, unless you're really large scale and feeding lots of animals, and then it becomes really important. But grain, you probably can go with what you can Google about how much energy is in those different grain types. But our conserved fodder, so our silages or hay, can be very different. So if we look on that silage result, this is and you'll get total the dry matter of that silage. So how much is moisture and how much is actually feed, and then the energy in that per kilogram dry matter, and then as fed weight is. So you convert that back to a wet weight. So for every kilo of this silage that animal eats, it gets 3.5 megajoules of energy. If we go back to those other graphs, they needed, if that would maintain a 45 kilo dough, a kilo of that stuff. Whereas once they get up into when they need 20 megs, then they've got to eat a whole heap of this stuff to get enough energy out of that. So at different times, different nutrient density matters as well. So and we'll cover it next, but the rumen can't, particularly as they get into late pregnancy, you've got two kids in there pushing against the rumen, and so often they can't actually eat enough of sort of roughage type feeds, and so that's when sort of your grains become fairly important. But this could be that could say 7 and a different dry matter percentage. So you could, if you're thinking it's a 9.8 and it's actually a 6.5, then that's a completely different. You're actually underfeeding them when you think you're feeding them, or the other way, you could be feeding them less of. And so actually knowing these numbers is fairly important, particularly if you're buying it in, then you can demand this of hay and silage that you're buying. If you're making your own, again, if it's small numbers, you might not worry about it. You might just monitor the condition score of the goats or see if they're eating it and make some adjustments. But if you've got a heap of it, then it's well worth doing the test and just knowing where you're at so you can do some accurate feed budgeting. Another thing to be aware of is the NDF, the neutral detergent fibre content of different feeds. And it sort of basically, even if the energy, and people got caught with canola silages and stuff a couple of years ago, that the frosted canola got made into forage and looked like it was testing great. It had good energy and had good protein and looked like a great feed. But because of the NDF in that feed, you actually couldn't feed. The animals were losing weight because they couldn't actually get that energy through the rumen. So through the rumen, because essentially, if you think of eating straw versus eating clover leaves, the straw has a lot more fibre in it, and therefore and we know that the hole out of the back of the rumen is basically washed out rumen flora and fauna, and so it's bacteria and stuff that have died is what the animal actually lives on, and so the rumen's got to convert whatever you put in the top end has to get converted down to small particles to go out the back of the rumen into the rest of the digestive tract. So if it's a really high fibre feed, then that really slows them down in terms of that passage rate, and therefore you can't get essentially you can't, even if there was energy in there, you can't get it at it because they can't eat enough of it in a given day. So getting the NDF of some of your conserved forages is important, because sometimes really good hay you can feed or really good silage and you'll get their energy requirements, but other times you can only feed a certain amount of that, and then the rest will need to be grain or something else to get the energy they're required. So just having a look at NDF is important. A pretty simple calculation: 120 divided by NDF is the percent of body weight that an animal can intake of that feed. So I can't do that maths in my head, but a calculator could do it. And so if you had at 50, we'll do easy, we'll go to 60, we'll do easy maths. So if the NDF was 60, 120 divided by 60 is 2% of body weight that an animal can eat. So if it's a 50 kilo animal, then it can eat a kilo of that feed. Is that pretty simple calculation. But again, worth knowing, particularly when things are a bit tighter and you haven't got pasture in front of you. If you've got green pasture, most of this doesn't matter. As I talked about before, and I've managed to burn this out pretty well, the secondary follicle development in sheep, it's all done by at birth. You don't get any secondary follicles further development. Whereas Bruce McGregor's shown that it continues into early lactation in Angoras, and why that matters to us is because these are our mohair factories and our cashmere factories, and I haven't seen what the impact of nutrition on cashmere is, but in mohair, the more secondary follicles you get, the more, which will be the same in cashmere, the more secondary follicles. That's the fine follicles. They're our factories, so the more there are, the finer the mohair is, and the more fleece weight you get. And so genetically, we're trying to do this often to try and get finer mohair and more of it. But then nutritionally, we can also feed, and our pregnancy management through that late pregnancy will impact on so you can have less secondary follicles developed, which means you'll have, for their lifetime, they'll be stronger micron and have less mohair. And equally, in that early lactation period, if you underfeed them through that period, then equally you don't get as many secondary follicles developed, and therefore you get stronger mohair and less of it. So there's a double whammy, and so kind of, even if we weren't managing our pregnancy nutrition, our lactation nutrition to keep more kids alive, although all of us like keeping kids alive, obviously, then this alone would make sense to make sure we've got its secondary follicle development as best we can. So something to consider as well. I haven't got the exact numbers around that because I couldn't download Bruce's paper in terms of, but we will get some more. We'll get some more fact sheets around this area over time, just so you know the scale of that. If it's deciliters of a micron, it's not as important. If it's 1 or 2 micron, then it becomes quite important. We are getting to the last few slides. So that's good. Other thing is to be aware of, I guess, is what's going on in your pastures. Lactation tends to be, depending on where you live and what you're up to, but you're sort of running into spring. And if it's a short, tight spring, then you might be into a senescing pasture before weaning. In other places, you might be able to wean onto nice green grass. But generally, it's a period where things are changing. It's because we're generally kidding in late winter into spring. And so important to consider what's going out in that energy as that pasture reduces or senesces, flowers, goes into dry pasture and then dry stalks. You sort of go from what is beautifully digestible, which is that sort of 80% normal green feed, which you're getting 11s and 12s of megajoules of energy out of per kilogram dry matter. So we know that animals fly on that stuff. They really thrive. But as we get down into late flowering and as it senesces and dries off, and particularly if you've got your barley grasses and stuff that are turning useless, you actually energy that animal getting out of that is reducing, and so the digestibility is dropping. So just worth knowing that in late, as you're going into mid to late lactation, to be aware that grass isn't grass, I suppose. The energy in that animal, in that grass, is reducing quite quickly. And if it's a really tight year, then you're often better off getting those kids off early rather than leave them there and wait to get them to your normal weaning day or your normal weaning weight. Often you're better off separating them out, because just that separation drops the energy requirements of the total system. The less, because together the animal you're feeding, some energy is just going through lactation, which isn't perfectly efficient. So you're better off actually having that kid off separately and maybe feeding it some grain or something to keep it ticking over rather than running it around a mum. But that will depend on the season. But just be aware that things do, that as the feed quality drops, then we need to be making different decisions around that. And if that happens early and you're sort of in that critical early lactation period, then you might need to be supplementing those does to make sure you're getting enough energy to keep those lactation ticking over. In terms of, and I couldn't find similar data on goats, I've gone with a lamb graph, but it makes sense. The more feed we put in front of animals, the more they grow. So these are pasture covers, so from sort of a ton of kilogram dry matter, or feed on offer, we often call it in Australia, pretty much out to 2.5 ton of feed. So that's sort of 10-15 centimeters of semi-dense pasture. Basically, the more feed you put in front of a doe and its kids, the more she will milk, and therefore the faster the kids will grow. They'll also eat some of that pasture themselves and grow pretty well as well. So mainly lactation's about how much feed you can throw in front of them. Does will generally lose a bit of weight early lactation anyway. That's the genetically programmed to do that. That's not a problem. You've got some late spring after post weaning to get that condition back on them. But you're trying to maximise your growth rate of your kids generally to get that get up to good weaning weights, because we know that heavy weaners are easy to manage. But there'll be an optimal there. The only thing in addition to how much feed you throw in front of them is legume. So if you've got either higher clover proportion or a loosened pasture or whatever, lactation tends to be better on that fibre, not because we often think that's just because it's higher protein, but the reality is it's because that feed is generally more digestible, and therefore they can pump more through, and it's higher. So it's a higher quality feed, and more octane, I suppose, and until you end up with better lactation and better kid growth rate. But yeah, really, once you're into lactation, it's just the more the merrier in terms of feed. Obviously we want to be doing that on green pasture as much as possible, which is why we kid when we do, or the does force us to kid then anyway because of their breeding season. But generally that's pretty good. Again, twins are going to need a bit more than singles. You can't really feed a twin into a single, but you can close that gap by how you feed them. So that's pretty much it. And just a couple of rev up slides at the end. I think in this game, if you sort of, as I can't remember whose quote it is, but yeah, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. And I think that's the same with improving our outcomes around kids. It's not, you don't have to do everything and change the whole thing at once. It's just saying, well, this year I'm going to condition score my does once for the year, which I haven't done before. Or I'm going to try and pregnancy scan if I can, or I'm going to do something slightly different this year than I did last year, and then see how that goes, and then move on to the next thing. It's not about we all know that everyone's busy and got plenty of things to do, but it's about working out what small difference you can make. Maybe it is putting up a temporary fence that means you can separate those skinny twins out, or whatever it could be, or adding water somewhere so you can separate those animals. Often small little changes can have a big impact. On the same theme, the Kaizen, which is the sort of Toyota philosophy of one thing better each day. It's slight shifts, thinking about what can be done better this year than last year to keep things ticking forward. And that's what 0.05% per day does over 5 years. So I guess, just pointing out that little changes can make big differences. I know we can't. It'd be awesome if we could go from 1,000 to 2,500 kids in 5 years. That'd be amazing. That's obviously a bit inflated, but just trying to demonstrate the concept that compounding change is really powerful in a livestock business. That's it from me. I'm 5 minutes over. Apologies. If you could rate tonight's session for us, that'd be amazing. We're really thankful of the support we've got from AgriFutures and our steering committee in the project. We really are, and we want it to be industry led. We want to be helping as much as we can, and so we keen to hear your thoughts. There's a link I've just put in the chat. If you could hit on that, and then and it'll give you an opportunity to give us some feedback from tonight, and opportunities to what else you would want to hear from us next. We've got our podcast, which we've got a few episodes up on. Again, if you know someone that you think it'd be good to interview, we'd love to hear those names. Get in touch with any of us. if you're on here, you've already found the Goat Fibre Gateway. We really want interaction in there. It's at the moment we're feeding information in there, but the more we can have industry discussion, you ask your questions, or we just have general information going around, or questions and answers. That's awesome. That's what we're here for. We're trying to really stimulate the industry to get some uptake into new growers. I think the goat fibre industry is a fantastic industry with a lot of opportunity, and we're only going to get there together. So the more we can work together to do that. So we monitor the Gateway relatively daily, or at least Georgia does, and she'll let me know if you've got questions, or if we can get some discussion going. That'd be awesome. But thanks very much for taking a bit of your Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon, and we'll hopefully, if you could fill out that form, that just gives us a good steer for how to go forward. But we'll be back with another one of these down into the future. Thank you.